political theme for the movie, and they had great courage to do it that way, and that's why it's so vivid and alive today, because it is so unusual, I think.
When did you first see the film and how did it affect you?
Oh, that's very interesting, because during the making of Raging Bull, Scorsese was showing me the films of Powell and Pressburger bit by bit on video, unfortunately. And he had already discovered Michael Powell and brought him to America, had encouraged people to run the films, and so the Museum of Modern Art was running a retrospective, and Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger had both come for it. And Marty said, when they run The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp at the Museum of Modern Art, you have to go see it there, not on video. And I went, and of course he let me go, you know, instead of working on Raging Bull, which was amazing. And while I was there, I saw Michael Powell, and I went up to him and said, I'm Martin Scorsese's film editor, and he was very sad, I noticed. Emmerich was bouncing around talking to friends who were in the audience, but Michael was very sad, and he said, I'm remembering the people in the film who meant so much to me. I was impressed by his sadness. I think it had a great deal to do with Deborah Kerr, of course, but probably his whole career, how it had been ripped away from him before it should have been in England, is very well reflected in the film, in the character of Anton Volbruck. But for Michael, I think it had many personal dimensions. He had been madly in love with Deborah Kerr during the making of the film. They almost married. They broke up, and that was an incredibly painful thing for him in his life. And so the film certainly had echoes of her always. But I think he loved it deeply. In fact, in a letter I just discovered recently, he wrote to his mother at the time he was making the film to say to her that he thought maybe this was going to be one of the most important films ever made in England. So everybody on the film seemed to sense that there was something special going on.
Now, from the perspective of Emmerich Pressburger, it seems that there's a strong identification between him and the Anton Volbruck character. Do you think that's true?
Incredible. You know, Emmerich had come from Hungary to Prague, to Berlin, where he got into the film business and had to learn to write in German. When the Nazis came, he fled to France, had to learn to write in French, and then came in the middle of the 30s to London and stayed and had to learn to write in English. He was classified as an enemy alien because he had originally fled from Berlin. And he remained in that status along with many other great, great artists at that time, Alfred Junge, Hein Heckroth. They were all classified as enemy aliens. During the time he was making these great films in England that were supporting the war effort, all during that time he was classified an enemy alien, and he had to report to the police station once a week. He had to acknowledge curfews, and he was not even allowed to go to Canterbury when they were making A Canterbury Tale, because the D-Day invasion was being planned at that moment, and they wouldn't let him go, which is just unthinkable. I mean, somewhat like a Blimp, but in the most profound ways not. Because he's not a nasty man. He's not a man with old-fashioned ideas to a certain extent that are invalid. It's just that times have changed, and he has to find a way to digest them in the new times. But I do think the great gift of the film is that people are portrayed lovingly and not as villains. As we know, there are no villains in Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger's films. There are really no villains, in a way, in Martin Scorsese's films. It's something they share. They're interested in the gray area of human behavior, which is more like all of us are. And so you come to understand people in their films who may be doing bad things, but you come to understand why. And you, in an odd way, care for them, which is why these films live, I think. The way that Laurence Olivier, who was supposed to play the character of Clive Candy in the film, he probably would have played him more that way because he was in the Fleet Air Arm and quite fed up with some of the military types he was encountering. Michael claims that he and Ralph Richardson were constantly crashing planes in the Fleet Air Arm. But when the government refused to give Laurence Olivier to appear in the film, then Michael replaced him with Roger Livesey, and I think it was such luck that that happened, because Roger Livesey is really Michael Powell's alter ego. He has the same optimism that Michael Powell had. In fact, on Michael Powell's gravestone, he asked that it say, Michael Powell, film director and optimist. And that's a very critical way that Roger appears in all the Powell Pressburger movies. He's got a lovely sense of humor, which Michael had, and a sort of bouncy appreciation of life. And just as John Wayne was Ford's alter ego, I really think that Livesey was Michael Powell's, and it would have been an entirely different film with Laurence Olivier in it. Because some people in England didn't like the gruffness of his voice, which of course is one of the most wonderful things about him. Michael had always championed him and tried to put him in films, and often had Roger knocked out of contention. And then he did a magnificent transformation of his body, which Robert De Niro became very interested in after Scorsese had brought Michael Powell to America and introduced him to people like De Niro, and he had shown De Niro the films that Powell and Pressburger had made. De Niro really wanted to know how Roger Livesey gained the weight so effectively from the time he was a young man until the time he's an old man. And Michael Powell said, well, we did build a carapace for him, and we used a double from the back sometimes in the bath sequences, but basically it was acting. It was acting. And it is. I've looked at the film so many times now while I was color timing it, and I cannot figure out how Roger is doing what he's doing. Certainly his eyebrows get bushier, his hairline recedes, but it's much more than that. It's body language, it's the way he uses his voice, it's his mannerisms. It's mysterious and beautiful. The reason some of the reviewers said about this film, what is it about, which I burst out laughing when I read that, because my first reaction is, why does it have to be about something? Why can't you just engage with the film and feel what the film is doing? You don't have to put it into a nutshell. It's nothing that Powell and Pressburger ever did. They knew life was much too complicated for that. So I think that people do have trouble figuring out the character of Clive Candy, because they're not quite sure what and who he is. But for me, I've never had that problem. I accept him completely. I accept him as a young officer who's just won a Victoria Cross, who wants to help and therefore goes to Berlin, and he's filled with good meaning. And then when we see him later as someone who's protesting techniques that he doesn't approve of, like torture during wartime, you begin to realize that maybe he's falling a little behind the times. But by the time you reach him as an old man, I just think he's absolutely adorable. I love the character. I've never had a problem with it, so I can't really...
I mean, you spent 3 hours with those characters,
yes,
and you end up on a note of deep melancholy, don't you think?
Well, yes, so there's that little optimistic salute at the end, you know. I think Scorsese has been deeply drawn to this film because of the beautiful sense of loss in it. Roger Livesey loses the great love of his life by not recognizing early enough that he's in love with the woman who then his dear friend marries. And then later you see that he loses his wife, his house is bombed, he loses his career as a general, he's removed. So there's a tremendous sense of loss in the film. But for me, I always feel that he goes on, Clive Candy, and he doesn't become bitter. or negative, really, and neither did Michael Powell. I think one of the great victories in Michael Powell's life is that he never became bitter even when his career was smashed way too early, long before it should have been. It would be as if Scorsese now in 2012 had been told 8 years or 10 years ago that he could never make another film in his own country, or ever. It's just impossible to think about, but Michael Powell never let that eat him up. He just went on believing and writing scripts and helping young people who had good ideas, and never gave up his love of life or film. And I think that that is reflected for me in Blimp. I think the way at the end he says, well, I'm going to invite this young man who's disgraced him. I'm going to invite him to dinner. And at the very, a distinct difference. And she just looks phenomenal in the film. The more I looked at the film as I was color timing it, the more I realized that there's a little moment where when World War I ends and Claude Candy and Murdoch are out with the car. He's trying to fix the car, and they receive word, and the war does end. And Murdoch says to Candy, she must have been a common kind of woman. And Candy says, what do you mean? She was a remarkable woman. And he says, well, you remember there was that woman you saw in the picture goer, and then there was that woman you saw in the film and you thought it was her, and then there was... So obviously, during his life, he has been seeing this woman many times. We're only seeing 3 of them because they did enter his life, but I hadn't picked up on that the first couple of times I saw, the many times I saw the film. But now that I've been able to see it over and over again, I realize it's very funny, and then he gets cut off. It was quite shocking for people at that time, I think. What happened was that when Powell and Pressburger went to the Ministry of Information to request help making this film, the script was sent to the War Department because they were going to need tanks and trucks and uniforms. And the War Department, unfortunately, reacted rather badly to it. They got frightened by it. They thought that it was going to make fun of the British Army. They particularly didn't like the speech that Anton Volberg makes, indicating that we're going to have to fight like the Nazis fight, which is it's a controversial speech, that. And so they tried to convince Powell and Pressburger not to make the film. And there were many meetings and an incredible correspondence that went all the way up to Winston Churchill, who kept saying, pray tell me, how can we stop this film? We must stop this film. He had been whipped up by the War Department. And so finally, there was a final meeting where they were told that they were not going to release Laurence Olivier from the Fleet Air Arm to appear in the film. They wouldn't give them any uniforms, guns, trucks, nothing. And Michael Powell said, are you forbidding us to make the film? And the man at the War Office said, oh, for heaven's sakes, don't say that. Please, this is a democracy. We don't do that kind of thing. No. But please don't make the film, or the old man's going to get very angry, meaning Churchill, and you'll never get a K, meaning you'll never get a knighthood. And they never did. But as Marty said, they had the film instead.
Clyde never accomplishes anything very heroic in a way. Anton is more heroic.
Well, he got the Victoria Cross. Yeah. That's pretty big.
But you don't see that.
I know. Well, that's one of the things you don't. That's the great thing about the film, that you don't see these things. But let me just answer that. Emmerich Pressburger would always get a little upset when Michael Powell talked about Churchill trying to stop the film, because he felt that Churchill had been whipped up unnecessarily by the War Department, and that if he had not been whipped up, he might have seen the film completely differently. And so I do think that he had just been, his mind had been so poisoned, and here was perhaps the whole sympathetic way that a German is portrayed in the film might have upset him when he was dealing with a country that was being bombed. But I do think that he had just probably lost his perspective on it. I mean, he had some very strong opinions. I went to see a Picasso exhibit, the influence of Picasso on British painters. And one of the things they said was that Churchill said if he ever met Picasso on the street, he was going to beat him up. That's how strongly he felt about this great genius's work. So, he was a he was not ready to take any steps into more unusual, uncliched, unsentimental, but packed with emotion films. His favorite film was Lady Hamilton, which in my opinion is not a very good film. But it's a traditional way of portraying Nelson as the great British hero, right? But it fails as a film because it didn't deal with the kind of things that Powell and Pressburger would have done with a character like that. They would have made him come alive. They wouldn't have just made him a Hollywoodized hero.
Yeah. And maybe Churchill felt that he was targeted by Blimp, or that he was a Blimp.
Yeah, because he looks like a Blimp.
Yeah.